if you love somebody, you want to tell them the truth. You don't want to see them heading to a lost eternity. But too many Christians today have just bought into the worldly advice: live and let live, don't rock the boat, don't try to upset anybody.
Hey, and welcome to the Daily Declaration podcast. I'm Cody Mitchell, and today I was joined by Bill Muehlenberg to discuss being the church in an increasingly hostile culture. Bill is a prolific author and a much sought-after media commentator who's been featured on most Australian television and radio current affairs programs. He also hosts his own blog, Culture Watch, which I encourage you to check out. I also apologize for the lack of video for some parts of this podcast, but I really hope you enjoy it. The conversation was really fruitful. Thanks for joining me, Bill.
Great to be with you.
Awesome. So could you just start off by giving us a quick about you piece?
Yeah, a lot to say. Old guy, lack of accent means I'm from the US, but married to an Aussie, which is my excuse for being here. I've been here about 33 years now, made the rounds of a lot of the various groups, focus on the family, Quadrant Magazine, Institute of Public Affairs, Australian Family Association, Soul Shakers. So I've been doing a lot of kind of family stuff, life stuff, culture war stuff. And about 15 years ago, thought I'd keep doing it, but from the comfort of home with my own interactive website called Culture Watch. So still doing much of the same that I was, not as much of the hardcore secular media interviews that I used to do a lot, and not as much of the lobbying, flying up to Canberra and so on, talking to politicians. Now it's more just the writing of articles and still teaching at various places. So that, in a very quick nutshell, I guess, is kind of who I am, why I'm here, and what I do.
That's awesome. Thank you. No, I think you sound pretty qualified. Your experience in a pretty broad range of areas, like theology and culture, and that it makes you pretty qualified to answer the next question, which I was going to ask you, what do you see as kind of the top threats and challenges that face the church in Australia today?
Good question. Big question. We could do broad brush strokes, right? The same that it's always been a problem with, not loving God with heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself. That kind of sums up most of our problems, but you might want a few more details than that. So, there'd be a number of things, true not only of the Australian church, but basically the Western church as a whole. Not as much commitment, dedication to Christ. We got it easy in the West: materialism, consumerism, the good life. So much of the world has rubbed off on the church. So, trying to live a peaceful, affluent life, as Francis Schaeffer used to talk about, that seems to have affected as many Christians as non. So trying to make it big, get your third car, your fourth European vacation, and so on, your big plasma screen TV. Our priorities are not always where they should be, in other words, and we've tended to let a materialistic culture overtake us in so many ways. Other things come to mind, the whole crisis in truth, which is obviously a big part of the world, the postmodern dislike of absolute truth. Too many Christians have bought into that as well. We end up saying, well, true for you, but, what's true for me? It all differs. There is no absolutes by which we can measure truth any longer, or right and wrong. So the spirit of the age that talks about we have to be tolerant and not judge anybody, that too has impacted the churches. So a lot of Christians are afraid to even proclaim the gospel, to even say Jesus is the only way, to say some things are right and wrong. Killing babies in the womb is not right. Destroying God's institutions of marriage and family, that's wrong. But sadly, so many Christians are afraid to even do that. They have a wrong understanding of love If you love somebody, you want to tell them the truth. You don't want to see them heading to a lost eternity. But too many Christians today have just bought into the worldly advice: live and let live, don't rock the boat, don't try to upset anybody. But hey, when you've got a 5-year-old kid on the street chasing a ball and there's a truck roaring down, guess what? The best thing you can do for that kid and that family is disrupt things, run out, grab the kid, tear him off the street before the truck runs him over. So, love means being involved, taking a stand, speaking out against that which would endanger us all. So that would be another one. Obviously, the whole sexuality front, where we've simply copied the world instead of challenged the world. So, we could go on with the list of things, but a refusal to be salt and light, to take our commission seriously, to let Christ be Lord over every area of life, including culture, politics, economics, social issues, art, literature, entertainment, all these areas I think we should have some Christian bearing on. But sadly, too many Christians have simply withdrawn, given up. And guess why? We keep losing, right? The other side has filled the vacuum. They're happy to get involved. They're happy to fight the good fight. We're asleep at the wheel. They're winning one fight after another. And then we scratch our heads wondering why the church is in such a bad way.
No, there are a lot of points you raised there, and I think they're all, very, very valid points. I maybe this is something that's more. I mean, you alluded to this a little earlier, but maybe this is something that's more strong in my generation than ever before. Is this reluctance, I guess, to participate in cultural conversations, particularly if they're confrontational. Could you, in sort of, I guess, summary form, say why is it important that we do?
Well, first of all, the other side thinks it's important, and the other side is doing it all the time, right? Secularists, atheists, humanists, well, anybody and everybody, they all know the value of getting your point of view across in the public arena. Everybody's pushing their morality, their agenda, their worldview. So certainly in a democracy, Christians should be able to do it as well. In fact, well, that's part of the problem. The church has been hoodwinked into thinking that we're trying to ram our morality down the throats of others, but everybody's doing it, right? Atheists do it all the time. Pro-aborts do it when they try to seek abortion fully legal. They're pushing their morality on the rest of society. But again, this is still a free society in which all points of view should be allowed to be given a hearing. Now, we could step back and say another one of the faults of the church, again, following the world, is we got these dumb ideas of tolerance and not being judgmental. So we're actually afraid to share any of our faith commitments, whether beliefs or values, because we think, oh, well, we're being judgmental, and surely the Bible says we shouldn't. No, the Bible actually says we should judge properly, biblically. But so many Christians have bought the world's point of view that, we have to be accepting of everybody. We have to be nice. We have to be tolerant. Well, the other side is not playing by those rules of the game, certainly. And who says we should be tolerant anyways, right? We're told not to tolerate that which is evil. Jesus himself in Revelation, he talked about, you guys, you're tolerating the sins of others, of Jezebel. And, Paul says, hate that which is evil, cling to that which is good. So actually, Christians are not called to just tolerate everything. We're actually called to take a stand for what is right. We're called to stand against evil, certainly in ourselves to begin with, but in our culture, in our churches, we stand up for what's right. We are not to tolerate anything and everything. So a good part of the problem is the church itself has fallen down here. It no longer knows about proclaiming biblical truth, and it's allowed the world to browbeat them into silence. So we got to, get our act together.
Yeah, absolutely. That seems to be a common theme, is that the church is, instead of influencing the world, being influenced by the world. And I guess another area that I hear a lot of Christians say, look, if we engage with the culture on these issues, even if we agree on these issues, it's going to detract from our preaching of the gospel. How would you respond to that kind of a
Yeah. Yeah.
message?
No, you hear that all the time. I guess part of the answer is, well, what is the gospel? What exactly do you mean by the gospel, right? If it has nothing to do with anything except getting individual souls saved and getting up to heaven, floating around on clouds and strumming on harps, if that's a kind of narrow idea of what the gospel is, well, then you might have a case. But if you believe the gospel is a little bit bigger than that, it includes, in one sense, the redemption of all things, bringing the lordship of Christ to bear on every area of life, not just in the next life, but in this life now, right? Well, then it gets a bit bigger. Then, is God concerned about the sanctity of human life? Well, I think he is. Is he concerned about marriage and family? I think he is. And therefore, part of the gospel would be to push in those directions as well and say these are important. Sure. Having a strong pro-life activism will not necessarily get individuals saved, but the point is we don't need to choose between one or the other. Why not both, right? There was an old taco commercial, why can't we do both? If you recall that, there's no reason to make a false dichotomy between sharing the good news that Christ died for sinners to lost people, but also to be salt and light, to have an impact for good. In fact, if you study the history of the church, that's always been the case, right? In fact, that's why the church grew. In the early centuries, it not only proclaimed the good news, told people about Jesus, it was up to its ears in social good, right? Some plague or famine would come along, the pagans would head to the hills. Guess who stayed behind and actually helped people? It was the Christians. And that really had a huge impact, and that's why, in large measure, Christianity grew by leaps and bounds. And whenever in church history it's been the most effective in proclaiming the good news, it's also been the most deeply committed to helping people, whole people, not just souls, but whole people. So whether education, helping women and children, prison reform, dealing with all the cultural issues of the day. I mean, simply look at Wilberforce, right, and the slave trade. Many critics told him, Wilby, old boy, just stick to the gospel. You got to stop these social issues. Well, first of all, millions of blacks today are thankful that he did not listen to that bad advice, but he knew he could do both. He could preach the gospel of salvation, but work to better conditions on earth. I think he was involved in something like 69 different voluntary societies, right, including the RSPCA. He was one of the original founders, right? If you like your pets, your dogs and cats, well, you can thank Wilberforce in part for showing the importance of treating animals well. That was part of his Christian gospel, his Christian mission. And I think he was onto something there, and we should be too.
That's so good. Yeah, and it's kind of, I guess, part of how we live out the gospel, and it ends up being, in my eyes anyway, a really powerful testimony to the gospel in our private personal lives when we go out and we do what God's called us to do. We speak up against injustice and speak up for the truth. So it is a really powerful thing. Yeah. I think that's the same sort of mentality that that says that we should just stick out of political sphere because we've just got to stick with the gospel. Also tends to be that same mindset that says, well, there's never any case in which we can resist the government or push back against the government. And you've been researching a fair bit into this idea of resistance theory. I'd love to get your thoughts on that. But first, just for those of us who are not overly familiar with the term, could you explain it for us?
Yeah, it's a big one. I've got probably at least 75 pieces I've written in the last few years on this. And that's simply perhaps, rethinking or re-understanding what it means for the Christian to be a good citizen, right? Your classic texts, Romans 13, 1-7, 1 Peter 2, and a few others. On the face of them, and often Christians have read them to say basically the government is absolute, it must be obeyed implicitly, we should never resist, we should never disobey. End of story. But of course, if you look at the whole of Scripture, you see this can't be right simply because many of the great saints, often those listed in the Hall of Fame, for example, Hebrews 11, were those who actually defied the state, defied the government. Daniel and his friends, right, refusing to bow down and paying the price for it. Well, Moses standing up against Pharaoh. We have so many examples throughout Scripture, New Testament, right? Peter saying we must obey God rather than man. So look, what is the general gist of Romans 13? Generally speaking, we are to submit to government, but within limits. Government is set up by God in a fallen world. It's needed to restrain evil, to keep order, to punish those who do wrong. But it's not an absolute. Only God is absolute. So only God is deserving of absolute submission. Generally speaking, again, we run with what the state says. If it tells us to pay taxes, we can pay taxes where they're due. But when the state tells us to do those things which are contrary to the faith, then we have to ask, is there a place for civil disobedience? Is there a place to stand up and say, sorry, I cannot do this. God has to come first. And I suppose the several years of corona and lockdown madness would be a good case in point, right? How many churches blindly followed what the state said in terms of shutting down the churches, preventing public worship, keeping people away, or even if they did open, right, banning certain people, the lepers, as I call them, those who, for whatever reason, were not vaccinated. You saw most churches simply caving in here. Well, the state said we should stop worshiping the living God. I guess, we got to do it. Thankfully, some brave resistance fighters, we could call them, disregarded that. Had a famous case here in Melbourne, famous cases in Canada, John MacArthur in California. Various churches said, no, worshiping God is not some non-essential optional extra. It is the duty of every Christian. Sure, you can do Zoom and stuff now and then, but that is not what we call body life. That's not how you do public worship. That's not how the church is going to proceed. So some did defy the government and some were thrown in jail as a result, both here and overseas. So that's kind of what we mean by resistance theory. There are times and places when the government oversteps its bounds, when the Christian has to say, no, I cannot comply. Well, again, think last century, right? The Nazis in power. Most Christians went along with it, sadly, to their shame. You had others like Bonhoeffer, not only resisted the Nazis, but felt as part of his Christian conviction that he actually had to get involved in a plot to assassinate Hitler, right? That's pretty hardcore. Talk about resistance. Of course, he was arrested for that and died and was killed in prison. But I think they were onto something as well. They knew that, hey, the state is not an absolute. It's there to punish evil, to maintain order. But when it doesn't do its job, there's a place for Christians to say, well, at least we can try to reform government. We can try to, vote in better political parties and so on. You can work within the system. But sometimes there will be a need to work without, sometimes to disobey, sometimes be willing to pay the price, even on the issue of taxation, right? Well, back in my hippie days, right, we would say, well, we don't support the war effort, the Vietnam War, so we're not going to pay our taxes, or at least part of it we're going to withhold, so we are not morally complicit in the state and its involvement in the war. Now, of course, I'm a bit more conservative. I think actually we were right to try to stop godless communism. That's another matter. But the point is, well, even today, you could, I suppose, withhold some of your taxes if you believe the government is using money in very immoral and unjust matters. Sure, well, Christians can disagree what those might be. We have to be prayerful and careful in how we resist, but Christian history has always been that of cases of civil disobedience, saying no to the state, and often paying the price for it.
I guess it can be very easy to just go along with everything that the state says when the state agrees with you on everything, and when it's fundamentally undergirded by a Christian ethic, and as it has been for at least a few hundred years. But we are, as you kind of say, getting into some sticky territory now as the state becomes increasingly immoral. Are there some sort of simple, I know this is a massive topic, but are there some sort of simple criteria that you think we can use for determining when the government has overstepped their boundaries?
Well, the common phrase often used, right, is when the state commands us to do that which God says we shouldn't do, or when the state tries to prevent us from doing what the gospel or God tells us to do. Those are your broad brush issues, of course. Again, how to tease that out in details. I would say that whole issue of closing down churches would be one case in point. Well, again, in terms of taxation, we pay for all kinds of things now, including subsidizing the radical homosexual and trans agenda. So would there be times and places to, again, want to withhold some of your taxes for that reason? I'm doing a lot on communist China at the moment, and we can learn a lot from where they're at. The whole social credit system, where basically 24/7 surveillance, everything you do is monitored, checked. If you comply and do that which is good for the government, you'll get a good credit rating, giving you privileges and so on. If you're a bad boy and you're not complying fully with the Communist Party, you will get a lower credit rating and be prevented from getting basic goods and services. You may well be chucked in a gulag. And there is, of course, the Chinese gulag, which is now matching the Soviet gulag. And, well, we're seeing that coming here. The whole, well, this thing here, once you get it done, you'll put it on Google or Facebook or any number of the social media platforms, right? Twitter, Pinterest, I don't even know half of them. But we know that they've been clamping down hardcore on Christians and conservatives. And by the way, as I read more on communist China, many of these Western countries are fully in cahoots with the Chinese communists. So no surprise there, right? No wonder they're so anxious to censor points of view that are not deemed politically correct and so on. So again, same thing. What's going to happen when they start shutting down Canberra Declaration, take it off the internet, Cauldron and Pool, ACL, Culture Watch, and they really start forcing us to go underground? How much do we then resist? Do we just head for the hills and move into caves? Well, that could be an option as well. But we really are moving in quite scary directions, and communist China is not, well, first of all, it's geographically close, but it's not that far away from the West in terms of where we are heading, they know everything about us, right? My wife says, I don't like to give my name on phone calls or internet. I said, look, they know everything about you already. They know the toothpaste you use, the size of your shoes. I mean, big tech has got so much info on us already. And what happens if and when it becomes part of an evil government where they share that information, where your banking details, your buying habits. Well, all of that we know already, right? Uh, you and I, right? We can order something online or look. It could be innocuous, a pair of shoes. Next thing you know, on Facebook, the very same shoes that you were looking at, there's an ad for it on Facebook. How'd they get that information, right? So it really is getting quite scary where we're heading. And again, then the Christian has to ask, where do we go? Do we just put up with it? Do we all get herded into the concentration camps as they had in Soviet communism, as they are in North Korea and China? Do we resist? And if so, what form does that resistance take? I even have articles on my site, is just revolution a thing, right? I'm an American, right? So we had a revolution that helped to found America. They thought it was just. Maybe the English didn't think so. Will it get so bad that Christians even have to talk about justified revolution? Again, we at least have to think about these things. They're big questions. Christians have thought about them for 2,000 years, and there's been a whole range of options. Some, Anabaptists said we shouldn't be involved in the state at all. Nothing to do with politics, right? Don't join the military. Don't pay your taxes if need be. Just fully pull out of the political realm. Others have tried to baptize politics and say, we can bring in the kingdom by changing governments. Well, those are, I think, two extremes to avoid. But we really do, as 21st century Australian Christians, need to think long and hard about, okay, as things hot up, things get worse, what are we going to do? Do we just put up our hands, surrender, remain silent? Do we take to the streets, at least in peaceful protests? Right here in Melbourne last year, we had, hundreds of thousands of people marching for freedom against the lockdown madness, of which Melbourne was the worst in the world, and I lived through it. Standing up for freedom is a good thing, and there would have been plenty of Christians as well as plenty of non-Christians in those massive marches. So maybe that's part of where we go in the future. Speaking out, standing up, being counted, whether it means mass marches, getting involved in politics yourself, setting up a website, do podcasts for Canberra Declaration. There's a million things we can do, but I think we have to start waking up that a war is going on. There's a real assault on the faith, and we need to think how we're going to respond.
Yeah. And I guess a lot of this comes back to discernment, which is, a Christian character thing, and that links back in with some of the issues that you identified earlier, threats to the church. Is a lot of those are internal,
Yep.
that we are not, we're not thinking well enough. We're not thinking appropriately about how we should engage with the culture. Are there particular things that you can see that would help, whether it be training, teaching within the church, things that you would like to see happen to help us better work as a church to identify areas where we should be engaging and things like that?
Yeah, well, I mentioned before parachurch groups. You would be one, I would be one. Often they are the ones who are leading the way here, right? The churches as a whole tend not to, and there may be a reason for that, right? The pastor is busy. His main job is to teach the flock, lead worship, do the sacraments, and so on. That's kind of the pastor's job. So he may not be full-time able to do a lot of the culture war stuff and so on. But at the very least, he could, work with members of his congregation. Say, there's a group who are keen to do this stuff. They could form a social action group, report back to the pastor once a month. The pastor could be at least make the church aware of what's going on. And many churches do things like this. Some will have, say, a Sanctity of Life Sunday at least once a year, raise the issue of abortion. Sure, the church as such, the pastor maybe shouldn't be telling people how to vote and all those fine details, but it can certainly raise the issues that are vital to the Christian that the Bible is concerned about, and try to give a general set of guidelines as to how Christians can proceed. Look, again, just recently we had the decision about Roe v. Wade in America, the abortion Supreme Court ruling. Now, I would have thought at the very least, certainly in the U.S., but probably here as well, churches should have said something about it, at least afterwards, right? Wow, we had this great ruling. Did you know that almost after 50 years the Supreme Court had struck down 50 states and their rights to decide on this. After nearly a half century, the courts have overturned this, giving the states back the responsibility, the people living in the states, the responsibility of deciding how they would go. I would think just simply announcing that for 2 minutes in the pulpit, this is good news. God has been at work. Right. Just the other day on the social media, I posted some pictures of the fall of the Berlin Wall. I lived through it. I was alive when it happened, right? 1989. Tremendous good news. We can get so discouraged, bummed out. We think evil is everywhere, and it is. But sometimes we have some massive wins. And by the way, I've written some recent pieces on this as well, not just the Berlin Wall, but the whole series of revolutions that rocked the world in Europe at this time. Eastern Europe saw all kinds of things happening in, all the countries. Poland, obviously, with Lech Walesa, Solidarity. The Pope at the time was Polish. You had Hungary and Czechoslovakia and East Germany and so on. One country after another, Romania, where often people power, often led by the church, led by Christians, helped to topple these horrible, godless dictatorships that had in power for so long. So this is my kind of good news sermon free of charge I'm going to throw in here. But Roe v. Wade being overturned was great news. I think God was in it. The fall of godless communism was great news. I think God was in it. At the very least, our church leaders should be talking about this and saying, hey, the church can have a real impact. Again, Wilberforce, slavery, overwhelmingly Christians who were involved in turning this around. So we have a good track record. We've done a lot of good. We've tended to forget about our own past. We've either become overwhelmed with evil, or we just want to pull out and say, I can't handle it anymore. I'm just going to live my own little private life. Well, no, this is not the time to pull out. This is now the time more than ever to get involved and to make a stand and to have Christian impact in the world around us.
That's great, and it's really encouraging. I know there are a lot of people my age and who I know who are really coming, awake to these issues and the importance of becoming the kind of people that can have intelligent cultural conversations. I just thought I'd finish by asking you, do you have some particularly helpful recommendations when it comes to reading books to help sharpen our minds and help us to be more effective Christians in engaging with the culture? And say podcasts, maybe, if I'm not sure if you're a podcast person, but do you have any suggestions in that regard?
Well, in one sense, this may be the hardest question of all to answer, simply because I'm a book maniac. I can give you thousands of titles, and I have thousands of titles. I'm more of a book guy than a podcast guy, but it's probably easier to name names, right? Authors, speakers that you really need to run with. And I have plenty of bibliographies, recommended reading lists on my website. So if you really want the details, all the bibliographic information, it's there. But look, people like Francis Schaeffer, obviously, was so very important late last century. Charles Colson, another. Just about anything that they've written, you should read, and make use of. And the broader picture of a Christian apologetics, you get the C.S. Lewis and so on. But in terms of culture wars, there's so many good people that are doing so much. And by the way, it doesn't always have to be Christians as such, right? I've written a bunch of pieces lately on Jordan Peterson, right? As far as we know, not yet a Christian, but maybe getting there. He's renouncing his atheism. He's kind of moving, I think, in the right direction. But a lot of what he's said and done and written and spoken about, including zillions of hours of podcasts, great stuff. We can make use of it. By the way, this is what we call co-belligerency, right? Working with others who may not be fully on side. So in that sense, I'm evangelical Protestant, but I'll work with Catholics and others all the time, certainly on the life issues, the culture wars. We may differ theologically, of course, but I can work with pagans. I can work with all kinds of people. So whether it's a Jordan Peterson or others who are fighting the good fight, hey, I'm happy to run with them. I'm happy to suggest what they've done. Sure, I think we need the full package. So I'm praying daily, actually, that Peterson becomes a Christian. He would have all that much more to offer if he did become a real deal believer. But yeah, there's so much we can do. Look, obviously, Canberra Declaration every day has got great stuff. You can start there. Cauldron Pool has got great stuff daily. ACL, great stuff daily. On and on it goes. Hopefully, my Culture Watch page every day, there should be a new piece up. So, plenty of places to start. And if you're observant, you go there and you say, oh, there's all kinds of other good recommendations that they are mentioning. So there's no limit to either reading or what we can view online. But the point is, we have to be doing something. We have to become informed in a war of ideas, right? Good ideas are ammunition. We need that kind of intellectual firepower to take on the false narratives, the false worldviews, the false gospels. So we have to be informed, we have to be well read. And in the age of internet, there's no excuse not to be aware of what's going on, right? Perhaps before we could have claimed ignorance, but now with a bit of searching, we can find out all kinds of good stuff. So I encourage you to, if you haven't done it before, start reading, start checking out what's online, and do it not just to build up your own brain, but to make a difference for the kingdom.
Absolutely. That's fantastic resources there. Yeah, no, and I would encourage people to check out Bill's website. We'll have links to all of that in the description as well, for those full bibliographies. I've had a look, and yeah, really comprehensive list of resources there. So I really appreciate talking to you today, Bill, and we'll have to get you on at some point and have a further chat.
Yeah, it's been great. It's been an honor, and keep up your great work.
Thanks so much, Bill.